Thank you all for coming out on the middle of a Tuesday morning. Welcome to the Institute for Advanced Study and Grasping Water, Rivers and Human Systems in China, Africa, and North America. This is the first of three Chinese Studies and Global Humanities Summer Institutes, sponsored by the Changqing Guo Foundation and the Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes. The IAS and the University of Minnesota are very honored to have been selected to host the inaugural institute, which I point out would not possibly have happened without support from many organizations here on campus, and for which we are very grateful. And so I'd just like to thank the African Studies Initiative, the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change, the Institute on the Environment, the Consortium for the Study of the Pre-Modern World, the China Center, and the Departments of History and Asian Languages and Literature. And the directors of our Summer Institute are Ann Waltner from the Department of History here at the University of Minnesota, and Ruth Mostern from the History Department at the University of California, Merced. And finally, I'd just like to thank the Ies staff, many of whom you will see here this week: Susanna Smith, Karen Kinoshita, Christina Collins, Phyllis Messenger, Pat Nunnally, Lynn Doe, and our borrowed videographer, Angel Smaller, and especially our research assistant, Con Lee. So before I introduce our speaker, I just want to remind you that there's another public event in the same room tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Photographer Ian Tay will present a series of panoramic photographs, traces, landscapes in transition on the Yellow River Basin. And you can get a foretaste of this event if you go down on the second floor and look at some of Ian Tay's photographs hanging in the windows on either side of the IAS offices. So it is now my great honor to introduce Patrick Manning, the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of History at the University of Pittsburgh and the President of the American Historical Association. Professor Manning earned his master's in history and economics and his PhD in history at the University of Wisconsin, so we're happy to have him back in the Midwest, even if he is originally a Badger. He was trained as an African historian with an interest in economic, demographic, cultural, and social history, but his attention to the African diaspora and global migration has really expanded his scholarly range to the entire globe. And so it's now fair to say he is a specialist in world history. Professor Manning was the founding director of the World History Center, located in the Department of History and affiliated with the Global Studies Program and the University Center of International Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. His original scholarship has been balanced with significant contributions to the field, to historians' professional development as the Vice President of the Teaching Division of the American Historical Association, and to promoting research, graduate study, curriculum development, and international exchanges in world history through his leadership of the World History Network and the Alliance for Learning in World History. He's a prolific author, at least 14 books and innumerable articles. I won't list them all, but they include Francophone Sub-Saharan Africa, 1880 to 1985, Slavery and African Life, Occidental, Oriental, and African Slave Trades, Migration in World History, which is now in its second edition, and The African Diaspora, A History Through Culture. His most recent book, Big Data in History, reflects his interest and role as director of the Collaborative for Historical Information and Analysis, an international collaborative to build a world historical archive, a data resource supported by the National Science Foundation. So without further ado, Professor Manning.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that generous introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here at the University of Minnesota, to be participating in this already fascinating conference. Though I need to make sure to finish up, because I'm certain that this group will have a conversation to follow it with, I feel a need to cut into my time for a couple of remarks at the beginning. First, this is a keynote address, but let's set the term in context. That is to say that meeting has already shown the multiplicity of perspectives and the interest that there is in multiple perspectives, so that we need not think of the keynote as really the keynote, but as another perspective. And this is not just a story about this event. It's a philosophical shift that is taking place now, has been taking place for some time, but one can see it on a kind of a full academic scale at an interdisciplinary conference such as this, where knowledge is working its way from the truth or from the authorized framework to multiple perspectives. And then the next problem that goes with this is how to get not just multiplicity, but to get new insights and new frameworks out of the multiple perspectives. The point that goes with that, I think, is that for the interdisciplinary work and discussion that we're carrying on, that there's an opportunity for us to pay special attention to the terms that are used in the discussion, terms that are within disciplines, the terms that we use to bridge disciplines, or the terms that we use to contrast disciplines. And in some sense, not simply to get along, but to debate the priorities and the frameworks of the multiple ways of looking at rivers that we bring to this week's activities. Yes, I have made my principal academic business the exploration of history at the level of humanity, an attempt to figure out what is human history. This comes from the instincts of a person who spent a long time on migration history, and because it's history of slave migrations, an interest in movement and in inequality in human history. And then I've had opportunities to apply this thinking in various ways at a time, some years ago, where I spent a lot of time with maritime historians, and that was mostly oceanic, but a little bit inland waterways, and I'm happy to be able to expand my thinking about that here. It involves explorations of language and language groups as a way of tracing human migrations, genetics, social and economic history, and now rivers. I will mention that my good friend and colleague Abigail Owen, who is co-editing with me a collected work on the world history of science from the period before the 17th century, stretching all across the old world and to the Americas, and labeled translations. When she heard I was going to give this talk, she was disappointed to hear that I was not going to focus especially on irrigation, because that's where she is at, is the history of water and all the ways in which water is used in the time since agriculture has become a major human pursuit. But I'm the migration historian, and this is the approach that I will take. It involves looking at waterways and looking especially at continuity. So one thing you learn from thinking about world history over a long period of time is to seek out continuities, to find that while there's impressive change, there's more continuity than you might first think. And I'll just mention at the beginning a theme that I didn't get to develop as much as I wanted in the actual presentation, and that's a notion of public works, thinking about waterways and the way in which people have moved water around or moved their world around in response to water. Gives you a chance to see that public works are not just massive pyramids, but are collective work that on a smaller scale goes far back through history. So there's dams, canals, irrigation, there's cisterns, there's carrying water. When did we get receptacles that were good enough to put the young women to work in carrying water around? There's portages, there's boat construction. Construction of a boat is generally the work of more than one person. So those are the introductory remarks, and here's the framework that I'll follow. First, looking at the physical framework of waterways and watersheds. Then we'll look at the early migration and exchange of humans through inland waterways, and then back to look at more recent times and public works especially. And my head's going to be swiveling back and forth between screens. You might get dizzy. All right. So I have had lots of opportunities to teach world history, and in a world in which there are lots of textbooks in world history, and the authors of these textbooks have tried to get offer a situation in which, as the students open it up, they get a view of the world. But here's generally what they get. Right? One is that nuisance Mercator projection. Second, it's nations as they exist now. This is not a great way of thinking about the world a long time ago, if you're trying to. And so what else do we have? So one can think of something about waterways. So here's a way. So I've been trying to examine students on rivers and river basins. But you look at the area you know about, and you see the important rivers that are not listed on that short list, right? It's too short a list. It's not that it's no good, but all right. So another way is watersheds, and watersheds are bounded spaces, and these, of course, there's no labels on these. That way, if there were labels, you wouldn't be able to see the watersheds, but you can see them. So there's a start. Then here's another approach to watersheds, picking out, there's 23 of them labeled here. All right, so but you can also see, once again, the watershed that's important to you that's not shown there, right? So, but here's another attempt that adds a little more information. This is watersheds, selected watersheds, but distinguishing the black one's the one where there's not very much water compared to the amount of people, all right? So the Niger River, but also the Yangtze, and the Tigris-Euphrates are examples, up to places where there's really a lot of water. I don't know how the Marie-Darling made it onto that list, but most of the others make sense, and the Mississippi still has a lot of water compared to the number of people. You also note that this one, compared to the previous one, has got, it added back on the rivers for Southeast Asia. Okay, let's see. Oh, I went the wrong way. Can I go back the other way? Yeah. So there's no rivers there's no Mekong, no Irrawaddy, and here they are there. So that's, it's a little progress. Here's another way of looking at watersheds. That is, it's not the way you would want to give it to your undergraduate students first, but on the other hand, it does it at an oceanic level, okay? Everything that flows into the Caribbean is one unit. Everything that flows into the Atlantic from South America or from Africa is one thing. You get this divide, you get the whole Indian Ocean watershed highlighted here, and then the whole Pacific watershed. And then you also get a nice look at the areas that are inner basins. But the rivers aren't in any of those watersheds. So here's the approach that includes all the rivers. This is this guy, Ben Jones. I wished I knew more about him. I discovered his work on the internet a few days ago. He has a system, if you look down the bottom left, of ranking rivers according to their importance. He gets to decide importance, but it's a better list than most. And then he makes it so you can look at one after another of them. Okay? So, yeah, all those rivers are really important. There's that dot off of Thailand, it doesn't count, or Burma. But, and then here's the second most important set of rivers. And it's got the Parana and the Mackenzie. You might not have guessed putting the stuff at that level, and the Danube. And then this is the third most important level. All right, so we got the Yellow River in that case, and the Amur. And here's the fourth level. Now you might not know all the names of the rivers by the time we get to the fourth. level, and then the 5th level, and I guess I went to the 6th level, and we can stop at this point, right? But you still end up with something like that. It's not really helpful. What we need in order to give those undergraduate students who are opening up their textbook or preparing to do their map exercise is something that shows them not just the physical relief, but the basins and the major rivers as physical features that are permanent, pretty much permanent for all history. They move around, but not very much. And we haven't figured it out yet, but with the elements for doing it. Okay, so here's an example of African watersheds, the major watersheds, not the smaller coastal ones. That includes the rivers as well, right? So that's helpful. It also includes those dreaded national frontiers. Do they really need to put those on? Of course, they serve some purposes, but they also don't serve others. And here's another one. I almost got tricked on this one and used it, but those are not rivers, those are watersheds. Those are all the African watersheds. They're divided into the major watersheds. If there were just some way to get that in rivers. In any case, I think this exercise requires stepping way back and trying to look at watersheds worldwide and learning names of a bunch of river valleys. And on the other hand, stepping up closer and doing more detailed work so that this previous one on Africa, this begins to be usable. And then I live right at the top end. That's the Ohio River, and the right hand end that's where Pittsburgh is. That's where the Allegheny and the Monongahela live there. And this representation, this is a very American thing to do it in counties, but you can see that the watershed of the Ohio virtually reaches Lake Erie. All right, so now let's go over time. This is a concise representation of my argument that if you look at the language groups, the major language groups that are spoken around the world today, and if you make the only somewhat adventurous assumption that those language groups go back very far indeed, more than 20,000 years, maybe more than that, then you can use this as a representation of the early migration of humans from the African continent. So we have 4 major groups of languages on the African continent, and if we stick to the tropics, we've got Dravidian, Sino-Tibetan, Austroasiatic, Australian, and the languages of Indo-Pacific or Papua New Guinean, especially languages. All right, it tells you that seen in this way, the early human migration was a straight shot east across the tropics, pretty much along the coastline. Could have been a mix of on land and on water. In that the ecology was pretty much the same. It was relatively easy, and in the time period they're arguing about the time again. Was it as late as 70,000 years ago that this large-scale migration of Africans to the east began, or was it earlier, much earlier, as 100,000 years ago? But this process has reached its geographical terminus by 50,000 years ago. There are ample now remains of humanity in Australia and New Guinea. And you can see for sure that that people had to have boats, perfectly good boats, in order to do the last part. There are many of the scholars who think that the Africans waited, or that migrants waited until they got to someplace beyond Java before they figured out boats. But to me, it's just as logical that they had boats when they started from Ethiopia across to Arabia. Here's our best guess as the boats. Reeds, conveniently located at waterways and lagoons, estuaries, and so forth. You tie them up and they float. You get wet in those boats, but they still float. And you can repair them and replace them. The top version of this is of these boats from both the Peruvian coast and the Peruvian and Bolivian highlands. And then the bottom one is a 18th century or 19th century voyage to Tasmania. This is one basic sort of equipment for the waterways that got one all the way east. But I'm not supposed to be talking too much about oceanic migration. So I want to take a look at these big rivers. A couple major Indian rivers missing from this picture. That was the best I could do for something that's clear. And the argument is that as people moved east, when they got to a river valley, they got to a place where there was plenty of food, and could settle at that river valley and work their way up the river valley. All right, so up the Indus, up the Ganges, in particular up to Irrawaddy. We'll see that in a moment. There's one other river that's not listed, and it's the Red River, but you know where Hanoi is, and it goes up from there. So we can trace indications of early human settlement according to these river valleys. So this is research in progress, but what I've done here is taken all of the languages of the Sino-Tibetan language family, picked my favorite way of classifying them into subgroups. There are debates amongst the scholars in this field, and there's need for more definitive decision, and then marked them with a pin for each language in more or less the center point of where the language is, and then try to look at the overall picture. So the interpretation that I'll give you is that those red dots down at the bottom include especially Karen speakers of the lower Irrawaddy Valley. Many of them have been pushed out of the river and up into the hills. But these, I think, can be seen as representatives of the first settlements of human in that area. And that following that time, people moved up the river valleys, up into Yunnan. And so up to see where you mix of the white and the yellow and the purple, that corresponds to the place where language diversity is really deepest in the Yunnan highlands. And then migrations out from that in various directions. So over to the west, the white ones over to Assam, and then migrations along the southern flank of the Himalayas. Those are the blue ones there. And then migration, especially to the east. So the green languages are Chinese languages, and this interpretation says that over the longer time period, Chinese-speaking people and Chinese languages may be considered as coming from the south and east rather than starting in the north, so that the story would be a movement of Chinese speakers up to as far as the Yellow River Valley, and then at that point people get together and form themselves into more densely populated groups and begin a movement of culture and politics back to the south. But in any case, this is a story that's partly about riverine movements. The particular valleys are, it's hard to get from one valley to the next valley, okay, so that we're not portages from rivers to river, but nonetheless, this whole system of starting with the rivers and then spreading from highland areas out as climate changed. There were good times, bad times, sometimes for people's settlement areas declined and other times expanded. But this is the way the picture looks and the way we can use what we know now to guess about the past. Okay? So there's a quick look at tropical migrations. And now I want to take a look at temperate area migrations. So human migrants did not get to temperate areas either in Europe or Central Eurasia or Northeast Eurasia until about 45,000 years ago. But then very suddenly there were records of human occupation all the way across this area. This is, now it's all purple on my map here because that whole area is dominated by people speaking Eurasiatic languages. This is one language group that spread, I will argue, in a subsequent move. They weren't the initial human settlers, but spread out in some place between 30,000 and 20,000 years ago. But in the same or subsequent times, the Americas were occupied. So we have the brown area is the Amerindian languages, which, you know, they're working hard to come up with the exact dates. The dates are, you have to have people from the old world in the Americas at least by 15,000 years ago now, and it may go back further than that, or it may not. And then the yellow part is not any languages. That's a more recent movement of people over who are linked to Sino-Tibetan languages, actually. In any case, the point is, as opposed to the tropical areas where there are lots of different language groups and maybe a slow expansion, for the temperate areas, there are lesser large language groups, and it seems like a more rapid expansion of humans who in this later time period had it more together in any case. Now, what about the mechanism of migration? So here's an interesting set of observations that I learned from Paul Johnston, who wrote this book on migration and watercraft many years ago, 40, 50 years ago, and pointed out that boats made of skin, that is to say with a generally wooden framework and wrapped by skin, are prominent or existent all across Eurasia, all across northern Eurasia. Well, including as far down as India and Iraq. But he suggests, you can see, he suggests some place in Ukraine, something like that, as the beginning of this movement. But he points out, I mean, that arrow going to the east is pointing to Inuit and the kayaks and so forth of the very North Pacific. Here's some more evidence on that. This is a rock carving from a fjord in Norway, and so you can see a crude shape of a what one could believe is a skin boat, a framework with skin wrapped around it. And then the one on the bottom is easier to see. It's a bullock skin inflated, and so you could hang on it and kick your way across the pool, or you could put those underneath a raft and have a raft that would float well. And that's the way, the latter is the way they were used, especially in China. So I want to make the argument that people working their way along the Pacific coast to the north got to the point where reeds boats would no longer work so well, where it was cold. To the degree they were working in rivers, the rivers are moving faster. And also the animals are getting bigger, and so that an invention of skin boats may have occurred along the Pacific coast of Asia. And the breaking down this Eurasiatic language group into its constituents helps make this argument. That is to say, most of the subgroups within Eurasiatic languages, Korean Japanese is one subgroup, Gilyak is another, that's number 4 there. The Chukotian languages of Kamchatka and above, the Altaic languages, including Manchu, and so really the core of the Altaic languages is there towards the east. And then way out to the west, Indo-European. So it suggests a movement of people from east to west across Eurasia. Working out the timing of languages from linguistic evidence is really tough. I'm guessing someplace before the deep end of the Ice Age, which was 24,000 to 20,000 years ago, sometime before that, so 25 to 30,000 years ago. But here's my look at the way in which people would have been able to move with such rapidity across Eurasia. These are the routes and the portages. This is drawn as of the 16th and 17th century, by the time Russians had worked their way all the way to the east, and so Okhotsk was the base there. But also the Amur River worked perfectly good as a route to the interior with a couple of portages. So there's, you know, we think of Mongols riding their horses back and forth across the Siberian steppes, but here's this other way of going back and forth. Here's a look at the boats and boat making. This is the high-tech part, right? So this is, the top is the making of an Inuit canoe, and the bottom is the Uniac. This is the sort of high-tech version of skin boats. So I'll come back to explore those Eurasian migrations back and forth in a bit. Here's a look at the Americas. And the top image here is of a birch bark canoe. So those were developed in North America. They're not really known anyplace else. And then the bottom one is a dugout canoe on the Columbia River. Well, dugout canoes have been used and invented and reinvented every place. And they're used on the oceans and used on the rivers. And they're heavy, but you can make them really big. You can put 50, 60 people, if you can find the right log, into one of these. So here's my linguistic story about occupation of the Americas. It's based on the argument, I mean, people may have walked across the famous land bridge that's in all the textbooks to get from Eurasia to North America, but they could just as well have taken the boat, going along the Aleutian Islands, whether it's an ice age or not an ice age. It's a perfectly reasonable way to just go hop from place to place. A really good place to stop and build a community was what's shown in the upper left there. Those are all the members of a major subgroup in the languages of all North America, in the area around Vancouver Island, Puget Sound, and so forth. The other really good place is the Columbia River. Plenty of food shows up whenever the salmon come. Salmon come for spawning. And of course, the Columbia leads inland, way inland, and if you get all the way, that's the second map down there shows that the portage is relatively short to get from there to the Missouri River. And if you look at the top two oldest groups of languages in North America, you find that one of them is based in pretty much Puget Sound, and the other one is based pretty much in Nebraska, at a middle area along the, I've got it a bit south of the Missouri River. You know, we're doing guesswork in any case with these. And the map in the white is, these are my presumptions of where the ancestral groups were, that the North American coast was the founding point for large-scale populations in the Americas, and that the main subgroups either stayed right there, or one main subgroup moved inland, and then that spread to fill out the rest of North America, and others moved to the south. Here's a look at a later time. It's further down the linguistic hierarchy, but the groups that are known as Algonquian, that includes people who don't necessarily call themselves Algonquin, but this is a time that I would guess has about 3,000 to 6,000 years ago. There's a particular spread of a certain language group over a huge area. And of course, it's an area that's easily accessible by river transport, and makes me think of birch bark canoes as a particular time in which they may have been developed and led to a lot of new settlement. So there's a hypothesis. Now, if we do the same story for South America, we have over there at the left, my assumption that red dot is the place where language diversity is the greatest in all of South America, and it's pretty much the hypothetical equivalent to the North American Center for Dispersal in, say, Puget Sound. And then one group moved up to the Andes, other groups moved up and down the coast, and then finally some groups moved to the inland areas. And then the other two according to the colors, 5 different groups of languages that are throughout the lowland eastern parts of South America. And these are related to one another in ways that, you know, there's debates about just where they are in the hierarchy. But what you can see is a tremendous amount of movement, right? And if I were adept enough to put the rivers in there as well, you would see that many of those long, skinny sections of those maps are along rivers. Right? So water transport has been really prime as a way of getting along in the eastern part of South America. Moving along in chronological terms, I want to turn to Africa and talk about things that you can see from river connections within the last 6,000 years and less. So I put for myself a reminder there that the earliest known canoe, the earliest dugout canoe that's been dug up and authenticated is in northern Niger, in an area that is currently desert, but the climate allowed that for the period from about 11 or 10,000 years ago until 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was quite wet, supported lots of populations, not forests, but ample grasslands. And it was in that circumstance that this canoe was built and then left and then rediscovered. While we can't trace the specific routes, and while Africa doesn't have great major highways crossing the continent, no equivalent really to the Silk Road for Asia, nonetheless one can be sure that small-scale exchanges on foot or by water have led to connections all across the continent. So my examples are, first of all, bananas, which clearly and unmistakably came from Southeast Asia and reached the African coast someplace about 2,000 years ago, and at various points on the African coast. So in Ethiopia, the coast of Tanzania, and coast of Mozambique, where you get an entry to the Zambezi River. And then bananas became a really central part of the diet in the highland areas of right there at the edge of the Congo River Basin and the Nile River Basin, where the green and the pink reach each other. But then bananas spread all the way across the Congo Basin and all across West Africa. Right? So all of this happened certainly within 2,000 years and probably much faster than that. Asian yams, so there's an African yam that's most widely consumed, especially in West Africa, but there are Asian yams that showed up probably at much the same time and according to much the same process as bananas. The mbira is a Zimbabwean instrument. That's almost certainly where it was invented. You just pluck copper or other keys, and you have an amplifier for it, a gourd. Those instruments had spread all the way to West Africa by the 16th, 17th century. And then the xylophone. There's a debate going on now whether the xylophone was invented in Southeast Asia and came to Africa, or invented in Africa. Whether it went from Africa to Southeast Asia or the other way around. The term xylophone is widely used in West Africa for monster, very impressive xylophones. In any case, there's a trajectory that went back and forth across the continent centuries ago. Bells of kings, particular two clapper bells that one is quite sure were developed in what's now western Nigeria and became used by kings and dignitaries to call attention to their importance, all the way down throughout the forest to the savanna areas of southern Africa. And finally, maize itself, of course, maize didn't get to Africa until after 1500, and probably some of it went straight across the Atlantic to the African coast, but the main way that maize made its way to Africa was to go to the Mediterranean, to go to Egypt, to go up the Nile River to the other side of the desert to the places along the Nile Valley where it could spread east or west, and then spread west along the savannas of West Africa and down into the coast, and then down to East Africa as well. Okay, so again, no particular highway, but on the other, an interconnection leading to cultural exchange all across the continent. Okay, so now we're definitely within the era of agriculture and irrigation, even if I don't talk much about irrigation, in the last 10,000 years. I'm hopping up to Vikings, who were so interesting in not just for their Atlantic crossings, but for their trade across much of Eurasia. The red lines here show Vikings going, especially from Uppsala, that's the place that these folks want to focus on, through what's now St. Petersburg and onto the Volga River, all the way down the Volga to the Caspian. That's a fairly straight shot once you get on it. And that gives you access to, enabled Vikings to raid Persians. But then you can go up the Vistula and then through some small portages to get down to the Black Sea, and they launched a big assault or so on Constantinople. But there are other ways to go through. There's the Dnieper, and then there's the Don River. The thing about the Don, it's the one, it's not very well shown on this, but it comes very close to the Volga at a certain point. And it's why the lower Volga has always had a big city in it, sometimes a really big city, and in any case a major point of trade. Right, so let's see. Yeah, now, let's see. Oh, I missed a slide or so. I spoke to you before about people moving west across Siberia. Here's a picture about people moving east across Siberia. So this is the adventures of Yermak, who worked under Ivan the Terrible, and in 1580 was sent on an expedition to begin conquering eastward across Siberia. And so if you look, you'll see that this is a waterborne expedition, and there's various executions taking place in the top half of things. There's another version of this I wasn't able to find in which Yermak is in a very tough battle, and the Archangel Michael showed up and helped him out of the bind. But in any case, this essential part of Russian eastward maritime movement was by the waterways. And those crossing over those waterways involve portages. So I don't have pictures from the time of the portages. But this is Nicholas Burridge, a Russian-born artist who was in New York. He got to New York by the time, he was born in 1874, I think. He was in New York by the time he painted this, but this is his imagination of what it was like for the Varangians, Norsemen, to be dragging their boats across the portage from one river to the next. And here's the image that's got more attention, so it made it onto the program announcement for this talk, the Volga boatman. The painting was done in the dates between 1870 and 1873. We're already in the age of steam, right? If you look in the back, you'll see a steamer. But the point is, drawing boats up and down the river had been going on since time immemorial, and this is a particular way it was then. I found as well that if you like audio versions of the Volga Boatman, when you go look this up, YouTube will present you with the Red Army Chorus singing a stirring version of the Volga Boatman, or you can get Paul Robeson's version, stirring in a different way of the same tune. So while we're talking about portages, it seems important to take a more local approach. So this is Lake Superior. The bottom end of the image is the top end of what's now Minnesota, and it's Grand Portage. In national, it's a state park. There's a little more to it than that. But it's an Ojibwe settlement, as it has always been. So this was a place that was named by, obviously, French coureurs de bois, and obviously in the 17th century, as a key point for fur trade. And we'll see a little bit more about why in a moment. But the French were there until they lost the war, until they lost the 7 Years' War. That war started by George Washington in my neighborhood. The British took over for a while, and then once the U.S. got independence and the line was drawn, it was drawn along the Pigeon River. That's the border that you can wiggling along across the bottom, and Grand Portage was on the American side. And so the British moved up to a place they called Fort William, and along another river, and put their portage there for carrying fur trade to the west. Okay, then that place has been renamed and is now Thunder Bay. And Thunder Bay is a big town, and Grand Portage is a quiet place. But the reason it was selected was because of the incredible centrality of that place in that portage. So it was a portage because the Pigeon River down at the bottom has a pretty severe cascade. And so there was a 9-mile portage you had to do around the lower part of the water, and then you were on the Pigeon River and it would take you up to the Lake of the Woods and beyond. But if you look at the watersheds, you see that that point on the southwestern part of Lake Superior is at the juncture of the St. Lawrence watershed. Well, that's what the French fur traders were working from. And the larger, it's especially the Nelson watershed to the north, but the whole watershed of the Hudson Bay. But of course the Mississippi River watershed is right there as well. Okay, so that had to be the central point for fur trade for the whole western area. And as long as the fur trade was continuing, one or another of those towns was going to be really top importance. All right, a little bit about canals. So I'll just do one map of the biggest canal. The Grand Canal started, pieces of it built apparently 5 centuries BCE, was finished up at the end of the Sui dynasty, so in the 7th century, early 7th century, all the way from Hangzhou to Beijing, goes through Tianjin, goes through a lot of interesting cities. So an incredible amount of work, incredible amount of labor. One can say that there seems to have been an era of large canals between about 500 BCE and 500 CE, so Greek canals, Egyptian canals, or Egyptian-Greek canals, Achaemenid canals, and certainly canals in China, probably more canals in China than elsewhere. I know I've left off some of the really important Qin era canals that were dug, that worked for a while. And then it may be that canal work died down, but canal work got going again in what one could call medieval terms, certainly in Europe. So the portage from the Rhine to the Danube became a canal, and here's someplace that involved going up the Main River and then to the Danube fairly far down its flow. But the Low Countries, England began building lots of canals. You know all of these stories. You know, the American stories are great on canals. There's no way to list the number of them. The Erie, that was the easiest good canal route, so they did that one. Another terrific one was the Illinois-Michigan Canal. That would have been a really, really important canal, except railroads wiped it out as soon as it was built. The Welland Canal around the Niagara Falls had a longer time period. Finally, some big canals that worked, the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal. I've learned recently that the Comstock lode in California, so it was exploited from 1859 to 1874, a huge amount of silver. That was really important in actually getting the transcontinental railroad, especially the part from Nevada to California, constructed. And that railroad opened up in 1869, expecting to make tons of money, but the fact that the Suez Canal opened at the same time really limited what they could make out of that road. So these are interesting. And then, even though Peter the Great had made a serious effort, used up a lot of people's lives to try to build a canal across the Don and linking it to the Volga, he had to give up. And the Soviets tried it again, but World War II happened right there. And finally in 1952 it was opened up. But the point again is to take these great modern triumphs of canal building and to remind oneself, just as exercises in public works, how they are linked to a much longer tradition of much smaller but nonetheless important at a local level of reshaping of rivers to move goods and vessels along them. There you go. I'm done. Thank you very much.
So we have a few minutes for questions. If you will entertain
Questions, comments? Yes?
Yeah, you use the linguistic evidence a lot for early migrations. Have you looked at the coincidence or lack of same between that and the both the mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA evidence? Does that give you any different story?
As you can see, there's a lot of work to do to get that right. One difference is the genetic evidence gives you generations going in both directions. Where languages have one parent, they can have multiple offspring, but as you go back, there's one parent. So the language evidence is less unambiguous. There's a benefit from that. It doesn't, of course, it definitely does not mean that when a language moves to some place that the majority of the population moves. So there's going to be plenty of times when we have different answers from language and genetics. So to answer your question more directly, I've fallen a little behind on all of the genetics work. And second, even if I were up to date to figure out how to represent that and the language work at the same time is going to take a while. I'm really just working on trying to tell the story about migration through language to get that out there for people to look at. Thanks. Yeah, it's a problem.
So my question was about, there's a big question and a small question. So the part 20,000 years ago, if I remember correctly, when we have the big move from east to west across Eurasia.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious about the connection between that and climate, because that's still the ice age back then, and then at a certain point the ice age will end, and that's going to make not only the place warmer, but rivers will all of a sudden become a much bigger factor than they were at that time. So do we know that the rivers were still at that time in the places that they are now?
So the real glacial maximum was between about 24,000 years ago and 20,000 years ago. Right, but and what are the rates of slip? Temperatures declined quite rapidly from 30,000 to 25,000 years ago. The glaciers covered Europe, but did not cover eastern Eurasia to the same degree. So there was more open when the rivers were still flowing, there was still an opportunity for people to occupy and move their ways west at the early part of it. That's why I think that the Indo-European homeland is east of where it's usually placed, but somewhere in the Caucasus, really. And that in the period after the Great Freeze, when things began opening up, then there's time for big migrations. And in particular, Indo-Europeans were right there being part of the development of agriculture and then moving north and west in the time period that you would say would be about, you know, someplace from 12,000 to 8,000 years, occupying this huge area. Same time, by the way, as people moving from below the Sahara, so speakers of Afro-Asiatic languages, who moved up to Egypt and North Africa, which is all of a sudden not as desert-like as it was before, and move into the Fertile Crescent and Arabia. Okay, so that the Semitic-speaking peoples with Afro-Asiatic ancestry and the Indo-European peoples both get agriculture together and head off in opposite directions. This is the story that I think happened. Then there's other stories later on. The Turkish expansion, the Altay expansion is a later one. Maybe there's 2 or 3 such expansions. One of them is certainly with horses. You know, horses get domesticated between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, and then 4,000 years ago, there's this tremendous expansion of horses and chariot warfare across Eurasia. So we now, it's not that it's all written up just right, we now have the resources for people really to try to tell these stories chronologically and specifically, and the geological record is incredibly improved over what it was. Okay, there's more research, it's much more precise, and for historians to use it that's where the gap is right now.
Any other questions? Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming and thank Professor Manning for this talk, and I'm sure we will actually be thinking about it and referring to it in the next few days. Thank you very much.
Oh yeah, this is not a good shot, but it's a reminder from National Geographic that fresh water is what, 2% of all the water there is.
Sorry, ocean. Yeah.